Good afternoon. This is a very important talk, but also on a very sad topic. The topic is geopolitics in the Middle East and in Syria in particular. Just this morning, we heard from more than 50 US diplomats. Usually when we hear from the diplomats, they are trying to dissuade a government from using military force. But these diplomats are actually advocating just the opposite. They are advocating the US, because they are US diplomats, to use force in Syria in particular. This is an interesting historical twist on an institution that was created in the State Department by the US government, mainly to avoid hasty decisions coming from the top, especially hasty decisions that would get us involved in military adventures abroad or would support military adventures of our allies abroad. The specific event that actually historically has become a landmark is 1971, a famous letter by Archer Blood, the then vice consul in East Pakistan, and some 20 of his junior colleagues. These diplomats very courageously used this channel called the Dissent Channel to send a message to President Nixon and the State Department and Henry Kissinger to change their policy of support of the military dictatorship in Pakistan, the military dictatorship of Haider Khan, which then was carrying on a genocide against the unarmed people of East Pakistan, today's Bangladesh, and it also has refused to cede power to the democratically elected representatives of Pakistan, both in the East and West Pakistan. That courageous move was not successful, but it established the precedent that US diplomats, the thoughtful and courageous diplomats, could actually use this channel to advocate non-militaristic, more peaceful, non-violent, and wise diplomatic moves on the part of the US State Department and on the part of, more broadly, US government. But in this particular incident, just the opposite is the case. The government itself has been restrained. The executive branch, led by President Obama, has actually shown considerable restraint and wisdom, learning from the debacle, indeed the disaster in Libya, and avoiding precipitous moves, especially in Syria. However, it appears that these diplomats think that they know better. Not all diplomats actually are in agreement. One of the wisest retired diplomats who has been to our school, the Korbel School of International Studies, with his daughter and spoke very wisely and perceptively about our relationship with China, Chaz Freeman. He said publicly that it wasn't such a smart move by these diplomats to advocate this policy. In fact, he thought that it was a very unusual type of move. Furthermore, somebody also thought that it would be a good thing to leak this move, which is a bit puzzling if you think what it is meant to accomplish. If the idea is to make President Obama change his policy, that seems naive at best. After all, President Obama is not a foolish man. And he is restrained in Syria not because he does not, in principle, approve the use of force. That clearly is not the case, although I think his proclivities is for settling disputes peacefully if they can be done peacefully. But he clearly, at least in rhetoric and also in practice, again, Libya is one of the most recent examples, has shown that he can actually support the use of force. But if Obama is not going to change his mind, then what does this league hope to achieve? It seems that one of the few plausible interpretations, perhaps the most plausible interpretation, would be to put pressure on Obama, but mainly to signal to our presidential candidates, particularly to Hillary Clinton, that these type of moves, militaristic moves, in Syria in particular and Middle East in general, and perhaps elsewhere in the world, for example, Ukraine and other parts of the world, would be the way for US foreign policy to go in the next 4 years. If that is the case, then it is not only foolish but really dangerous. One has to pause and consider how the world has changed since the fall of the former Soviet Union. That was welcomed by most people in the world, including those who were in former Soviet Union and in East Europe. In this country, people were talking about the peace dividend, which I think now has become a forgotten episode in recent US history. Instead of peace dividend, however, we found a move towards making unipolar world permanent and increasing military engagement by the US and people the US supported in the world. It led to the dismemberment of Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, among other things, and the history of that episode in US foreign policy and in regional and world history has not been quite written yet, but from the evidence that is in now, we can definitely conclude that it has been more destabilizing than stabilizing. The same thing is true about the expansion of NATO and the incidents in Georgia and in Ukraine. In Libya, against his better judgment, I think President Obama was led to believe that the intervention by the European powers, especially France, which was the most hawkish and thought that it would gain the most from dismantling the status quo in Libya, President Obama thought that these European powers needed our support and deserved our support. It would be, of course, foolhardy to speculate as to what he thinks really now, but I think the events have made it clear that that move did not succeed, and Libya is clearly a failure in US foreign policy, perhaps a greater failure in European foreign policy, but definitely a failure for the US foreign policy. If we turn our eyes to the Middle East in particular, we find that today Turkey is pursuing its own objectives, which basically have several dimensions. One is to keep the Kurds down, and the other one is to dismember Syria and increase its influence in Middle East. But the other part is to cause as much discomfort to Russia as possible, get actively involved in parts of the world where Turkey really needs to be much more cautious than it has been so far. By that I mean places like Ukraine, Armenia, Azerbaijan, more broadly Central Asia, where there are Turkic people, but they are not the only people in Central Asia, and even the Turkic people in Central Asia would not unilaterally welcome Turkish interference. So here we have really an unreliable and perhaps even bad ally. Turkey's other aim is to drag NATO into its own maneuvers in the Middle East and elsewhere. And NATO so far has been cautious but not very clear as to how they wish to proceed with Turkey. The most recent example of a huge bribe to Turkey in order to stem the flow of the refugees that largely originate from the foolish policies of the Europeans, supported by the US in the Middle East, and the failure of the dismemberment of Syria certainly has meant more hardship for the Syrian people and greater flow of refugees than anybody would have expected. Even if the policy had succeeded in dismembering Syria, one could still argue that there would be probably a similar flow of refugees out of Syria, given what is going on in Libya today, if we draw our lessons from there. The other so-called ally of the US, Saudi Arabia, is also playing the same kind of game, but perhaps from a weaker position, and has become a great liability for the US and for anybody in the world who cares about peace. It is probably one of the most repressive regimes in the history of the world, and certainly in the history of that region. It is a regime that has very little popular support and rules basically by repression and bribing when it can bribe people. It relies on mercenaries to keep peace both at home and pursue adventurism abroad. Its fiascos in places like Yemen clearly demonstrate that Saudi Arabia is not really able to rule on its own and relies heavily on foreign support, including support from the US. So it is a good question as to what kind of quagmire Saudi Arabia might draw US into. We do have other powers in the region like Iran. The nuclear deal with Iran on the whole is actually favorable to Western allies and the US, and in Iran there are many criticisms about how much Iran actually gave up by the way of concessions to the Western powers and what it will gain. So that's not really a sure deal, and one does not have to support the regime by the theocracy in Iran, this odd mixture of theocracy and republicanism in Iran, to actually see that we need to have a meaningful negotiating relationship with a power like Iran in that region if we are to act as an honest broker in the region. The other rogue state in the picture that I've been trying to discuss and present is Qatar, which is a very small state, which really wasn't a state in the last century. So it is a creation of Western powers, and the discovery of oil and gas in the region has a great deal to do with the existence of Qatar, as it does with the existence of all other Gulf states. But Qatar found itself in the position of having almost the highest GDP per capita in the world with this sudden surge in oil and gas production, especially gas production, and it also started looking for a mission. And it seems that the mission it found was to collaborate with Saudi Arabia and to actually develop a foreign policy that would be supporting the most reactionary and backward and regressive Islamic fundamentalist elements like al-Nusra and the Islamic State in the region. What is one to do with such allies is the question that our diplomats should be asking. Instead, they seem to be saying that we can fix everything basically by intervening militarily in Syria, changing regimes as we wish, and basically bombing the hell out of whoever gets in our way. Perhaps this is the time to briefly reflect on another episode of US bombing. And this was in Vietnam in the 1960s, and it should be germane to this discussion because people like Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton were young college students at that time. And although people forget a lot of things as they grow into positions of power, I hope that Hillary has not forgotten that during that period in the early 60s and mid 60s, the best and the brightest of advisors were suggesting that we could very easily bomb into submission the opposition in Vietnam and the nationalists in Vietnam, in Hanoi. That turned out to have been quite wrong, and subsequent analysis, even by people like McNamara, who was very supportive and in fact instrumental in many of the important events during the Vietnam War, show that the foreign policy was completely wrong and tragically wrong. Just to give you some idea as to what the US really tried to do, we can just quote from Howard Zinn's book. He mentions that by the end of the Vietnam War, 7 million tons of bombs had been dropped on Vietnam, more than twice the total bombs dropped on Europe and Asia in World War II. Almost one 500-pound bomb for every human being in Vietnam. It was estimated that there were 20 million bomb craters in the country. In addition, poisonous sprays were dropped by planes to destroy trees and any kind of growth. An area the size of the state of Massachusetts was covered with such poison. Vietnamese mothers reported birth defects in their children. Yale biologists using the same poison 2, 4, 5, T on mice reported defective mice born and said they had no reason to believe the effect on humans was different. So there you have it, the evidence from recent history. Now there are differences between Vietnam and Middle East, in particular Syria. We do not have a cohesive, organized, largely secular party and force as there was in Vietnam. Middle East geography, as people should know but seem to forget, was largely created by Anglo-French imperialism and then basically supported by US imperialism. And that is still the configuration in that area. So none of the states in the Middle East, with possible exception of Iran and Iraq, Iran and Egypt, really have any kind of long history of being a nation. And even there are minorities who are forgotten when people are presenting the imaginary of nationhood and nation state and nationalist ideology. This is particularly evident in Syria, where we have the Kurds in a small enclave. We have the Sunnis and the Shias. But that is not the main division, as many people might imagine. Although religious ideologies, like all ideologies, do have a reality of their own, or can acquire a reality of their own, people have material interests that actually are important. Given the material interests to now, a lot of the Sunnis actually have opted to support the regime in Damascus, the Assad regime, although they probably have no love for such a regime. But to actually try to dismantle the regime without putting anything else stable in its place, which is basically the scenario that developed in Libya, seems foolish, dangerous, and ultimately self-defeating. So although Middle East is in a less coherent shape, and Syria in particular is in less coherent shape than Vietnam was, and Vietnam is, and perhaps Vietnam will be, we have to think that ultimately the problems that exist in that region will have to be solved by the people in that region. If we cannot be honest brokers in that region, then we should really think of not interfering, least of all interfering militarily. Thank you.